The Senate chamber hummed with its usual rhythm, papers shuffling, whispers trading across the aisles, the weight of history pressing against the marble walls. But as Marco Rubio leaned forward, his tone was anything but routine. His words dripped with condescension, framed as a question but sculpted to diminish. He smiled thinly, confident in the trap he was laying, certain the cameras would capture him as the poised statesman, while Jasmine Crockett was forced onto the defensive. "Congresswoman," he began, his voice carrying that unmistakable mix of patronizing calm and veiled accusation, "do you even understand the complexities of what you're proposing? Or are you simply repeating talking points for the cameras?" The chamber shifted. Staffers looked up. Senators on both sides leaned in, the scent of spectacle thickening the air. Rubio was playing to the script of power: dismiss, belittle, assert dominance. It was the oldest trick in Washington, and one that too often worked. But Crockett wasn't built to flinch. Before Rubio could even finish savoring his smirk, Crockett raised her eyes, steady and unshaken. Her voice cut through the chamber, calm, precise, and sharp enough to pierce the marble itself. "Senator Rubio," she said, pausing just long enough for the weight of her words to land, "I didn't come here to audition for your approval. I came here to expose the arrogance that pretends ignorance is wisdom." The room froze. A silence fell so thick it felt like the chamber itself was holding its breath. Rubio blinked, his composure jolted by the directness, the utter refusal to play his game. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Cameras zoomed in. A ripple of energy spread through the audience, some stifling grins, others shifting uncomfortably, all aware that something unscripted, something unforgettable, had just erupted. Rubio tried to shift in his chair, to regain footing, but Crockett's gaze never wavered. The air was no longer his to command. In that single moment, the power dynamic inverted, and the Senate chamber felt less like a stage for Rubio's performance and more like the arena for Crockett's truth. And as the silence lingered, the question burned. If this was her opening, what would come next? Because that was only the beginning. Section 2. Raise the stakes. 600 words. The stakes of this Senate hearing stretched far beyond the chamber walls. On the surface, the discussion was about policy, numbers, statutes, and technicalities written into dense pages of legislation. But beneath that veneer, everyone knew the truth. This was about narrative, about power, about who got to define the future of America. The bill under debate carried immense symbolic weight. It centered on protections for immigrant families, voting rights expansions, and safeguards against disenfranchisement, issues that cut to the very core of America's promise and identity. To some senators, it was a threat to the old guard, a shift of power they had long resisted. To others, it was a beacon, proof that the nation could bend toward justice when leaders were bold enough to demand it. And in that crucible sat Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman with a growing reputation for sharp intellect and fearless truth-telling. But reputations, no matter how solid, could be chipped away in moments like this. A stumble, a hesitation, a poorly chosen word. Rubio knew it could be enough to brand her as unready in the eyes of the public. That was the strategy Rubio carried into the room like a dagger hidden beneath polished rhetoric. He wasn't just asking questions. He was sculpting a narrative. Every phrase, every patronizing smile was designed to paint Crockett as inexperienced, emotional, or unfit for the weight of national leadership. It was a performance he had practiced for years. Play the seasoned statesman, dismiss the rising voice, and in the process, remind the country who supposedly belonged at the center of power. He thrived on moments where his opponents faltered, moments that could be clipped and broadcast as proof of his dominance. Crockett knew all of this. She felt the intensity of the moment not just in the glares from across the aisle, but in the weight of those watching at home. Immigrant families, young activists, communities too often silenced. One misstep here could be magnified into a career-defining failure, and yet the very same pressure carried the possibility of transformation. A single, precise response could flip the script entirely. As Rubio pressed on, his voice curling around phrases designed to box her in, Crockett sat still. To some, it looked like hesitation, but to those who understood her, it was the calm before impact. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was control. She was taking in every word, every barb, every false implication, not to defend herself, but to prepare a strike that would dismantle his premise altogether. The tension rose as Rubio layered accusation after accusation, his confidence building with each sentence. He mistook her quiet for submission, failing to see the resolve gathering behind her steady eyes. The chamber leaned forward, sensing a collision. Reporters could already taste the headline. Staffers traded nervous glances. Everyone wondered, would this be the moment Rubio's trap snapped shut, or the moment Crockett shattered it? Because beneath the surface calm, Crockett carried something Rubio could never grasp. The unshakable resolve of someone who had fought for every inch of her place in that chamber. And that resolve was about to show itself in ways no one, not even Rubio, could have predicted. What happened next would not just decide the tone of this hearing, it would ripple far beyond, into headlines, feeds, and living rooms across America. And the first crack in Rubio's performance was closer than anyone realized. Marco Rubio had always prided himself on polish. From his earliest days in Florida politics, he cultivated an image of the boyish prodigy. Sharp suit, practiced smile, rehearsed one-liners. He knew how to command a camera, how to lean into the microphone at just the right angle, and how to spin a soundbite that could outlast the news cycle. In the Senate, this image became his currency. Rubio wasn't just another conservative voice, he was a brand built on composure, eloquence, and the projection of certainty. But beneath the sheen lay contradictions that never fully disappeared. Rubio marketed himself as the son of Cuban immigrants who understood the immigrant struggle, who embodied the American dream. He told that story often, and in those moments many believed he could bridge divides. And yet, when the political winds shifted, so too did his stance. He backed away from immigration reform when it threatened his standing with the party base. He turned from being a potential unifier to another defender of the wall, willing to sacrifice lived experience for political capital. The son of immigrants became, in many eyes, a senator who weaponized the very struggles his family once endured. It wasn't the only contradiction. In 2016, Rubio launched his presidential run as the fresh face of the GOP, the generational voice to lead the party forward. But when Donald Trump turned ridicule into a campaign weapon, Rubio faltered. His infamous attempt to fight back, mocking Trump's hand size, fell flat, exposing a side of him that seemed insecure, even petty. The moment haunted him, a reminder that polish could crack when arrogance met resistance. Still, Rubio endured. He rebuilt his stature, leaned again into the image of statesman, and positioned himself as a reliable face of conservative authority. He could smile while cutting down opponents. He could cloak dismissiveness in civility, and he never forgot the tactic that had carried him so far, underestimating his adversaries, framing them as unready while he stood poised and prepared. That was the energy he carried into the Senate hearing with Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was another rising progressive voice, sharp but young, passionate but unseasoned. He had faced figures like her before, or so he thought. To Rubio, this was a chance to reassert dominance, to remind America that he still held the upper hand in the arena of debate. But arrogance carries blind spots. For every calculated smile, there were moments Rubio's record couldn't hide. His campaign promises to champion working-class families clashed with his voting record against expanded healthcare access. His speeches about moral clarity rang hollow when ethics scandals rippled through allies he defended. Time and again he managed to deflect, to glide past these contradictions with polished words. What he never fully grasped was that for opponents like Jasmine Crockett, those contradictions weren't just footnotes, they were ammunition. She had built her career not on gloss or branding, but on grit, standing in courtrooms and communities where stakes were immediate and personal. While Rubio performed politics as theater, Crockett lived politics as survival. And yet even now in this chamber, he underestimated her. He leaned into the same playbook he had used for years: paint the opponent as inexperienced, position himself as the adult in the room, and let the cameras capture the contrast. To the casual observer, it was a strategy that often worked. But beneath the surface, cracks were widening. Rubio's arrogance blinded him to the shifting terrain of American politics. The days when authority could be projected through polish alone were fading. People were no longer impressed by scripted calm if it came at the cost of honesty. They craved authenticity, resilience, the kind of dignity that couldn't be rehearsed. and Crockett represented exactly that. Still, Rubio pressed forward, certain that this moment would reinforce his stature. Certain that Crockett would falter under the weight of his loaded questions. Certain that his smile, his tone, his well-practiced performance would once again carry the day. But this time he had miscalculated, because this wasn't the old stage where his playbook thrived. This wasn't a controlled debate or a campaign rally where applause could be managed. This was a Senate hearing watched in real time, scrutinized by millions, amplified by social media hungry for authenticity and allergic to condescension. And in Jasmine Crockett, Rubio had found an opponent unlike any he had faced before. She was prepared not just to answer but to expose, not just to defend herself, but to dismantle the very foundation of his act. The chamber didn't know it yet. Rubio certainly didn't, but the same polish that had long been his shield was about to shatter under the weight of a single, unflinching response. Because this time, his old playbook was about to collapse. Jasmine Crockett's journey didn't begin in the polished corridors of Washington, nor in the marble chambers of the Senate. It began in the raw, unfiltered neighborhoods where struggle wasn't abstract. It was lived daily. She was the daughter of working-class grit, raised to believe that dignity wasn't something handed down from titles or offices, but forged in the fire of everyday battles. Her path to power was not lined with privilege but carved out of persistence, and that difference would define every step she took. From an early age, Crockett knew the sting of being underestimated. Teachers doubted her. Neighbors whispered that she was too loud, too ambitious, too unwilling to stay in her place. But she carried those doubts like fuel, letting them sharpen her rather than silence her. She poured herself into her education, fighting for opportunities that others assumed weren't meant for someone like her. When she entered law school, it wasn't with the polish of legacy or pedigree. It was with the urgency of someone who knew she had to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. Law school was no easy ascent. She juggled jobs to pay bills, endured classrooms where her presence was treated like an anomaly, and faced professors who raised eyebrows when she spoke too boldly. But every obstacle became another test of resilience. Each lecture where she was ignored, each study group where she was sidelined only hardened her resolve. She would not just graduate, she would excel. And when she did, she carried more than a degree. She carried proof that brilliance could bloom from places the powerful overlooked. Crockett's early legal career didn't steer her toward lucrative firms or corner offices. Instead, she chose the trenches, defending those who had no one else to stand beside them. She represented clients who could barely afford her time, immigrants navigating systems designed to break them, families crushed by bureaucracy, and young people criminalized for simply existing in the wrong zip code. Her courtroom wasn't glamorous, but it was alive with stakes that mattered: housing, freedom, survival. Every case taught her that real power wasn't about winning arguments for prestige. It was about giving voice to those silenced by the weight of power itself. Her values were never abstract slogans. They were lived commitments. Crockett didn't just speak about immigrant rights. She marched, she defended. She legislated with those values stitched into her DNA. She didn't just invoke community. She was there, in town halls, at kitchen tables, on sidewalks where mothers pleaded for safer schools and workers demanded fair pay. She listened not as a politician calculating polls, but as a neighbor who knew the struggle firsthand. That authenticity became her signature, and yet authenticity came with costs. Crockett faced relentless skepticism from political insiders who dismissed her as too green, too emotional, or too risky. They told her to soften her edges, to play the game the way it had always been played. But she refused. She had no interest in mimicry. Her power came from being unapologetically herself, and that refusal to conform, to dilute her fire for acceptability, was precisely why communities trusted her. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett had built a reputation that was rare in Washington: grassroots credibility fused with sharp intelligence. She wasn't a manufactured politician. She was a lived experience in motion. For young people of color, for immigrant families, for women told they were too much, she became proof that resistance could translate into representation. And when she walked into the Senate chamber that day to face Marco Rubio, she carried all of that history with her. She carried the silence of classrooms where she wasn't called on. She carried the tension of courtrooms where judges doubted her clients before hearing a word. She carried the weight of every immigrant story she had fought to protect, every family she had stood beside when systems turned their backs. That weight wasn't a burden, it was armor. Rubio thought he was setting a trap, framing her as inexperienced, positioning himself as the seasoned senator with the upper hand. But Crockett knew something he didn't. She had lived her entire life in spaces where people tried to corner her, tried to write her off, tried to shrink her voice. And every time she had found a way not just to survive but to turn those dismissals into moments of power. Her struggle had taught her patience, the ability to wait, to listen, to let arrogance expose itself before striking. Her authenticity gave her credibility no amount of polish could replicate. And her immigrant-inclusive values, rooted in her own story and the stories of those she had defended, made her resilient against the tactics of intimidation. In that Senate chamber, when Rubio leaned on his rehearsed arrogance, he didn't see the years of training she had endured, not in think tanks or debate prep sessions, but in the lived crucible of real struggle. Crockett was not simply a politician facing a question. She was a woman forged in doubt, sharpened by resistance, and powered by conviction, and that combination made her dangerous to anyone who mistook her calm for weakness. As she sat there, listening steady and composed, the cameras caught only her stillness, but beneath that calm was a storm, waiting for the moment to rise. Every chapter of her fight had been preparing her for this very showdown, because while Rubio thought he was setting the trap, Crockett knew she was about to turn it against him. The Senate chamber had grown heavy, its silence punctuated only by Marco Rubio's voice, smooth but laced with condescension. He leaned forward, his words measured like a seasoned litigator, but his tone unmistakably sharp, as if he were speaking not to a peer but to a pupil who needed correction. "Congresswoman," Rubio began, his syllables carrying the polished edge of rehearsed authority, "some of us here have spent years understanding the nuance of these policies." Perhaps he paused, just long enough to let the suggestion hang in the air. Perhaps a little more experience might help you grasp the bigger picture before making such bold assertions. Gasps weren't audible, but the tightening of posture across the chamber said everything. Senators shifted in their seats. Staffers exchanged wary glances. The air had the static of anticipation, the unmistakable charge that precedes a clash too sharp to ignore. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the words linger, let them echo as if she were weighing their merit. But her silence wasn't uncertainty. It was a calculated pause. She understood the game. Rubio wasn't asking a question. He was setting a stage, framing her as naive before the cameras. The longer she sat quietly, the more he believed he had the upper hand, and so he pressed further. "You see," Rubio continued, his voice rising just enough to carry, "these matters require not just passion but prudence, not just conviction but comprehension. Sometimes those new to the room forget that." The word new was the dagger. He wielded it with intention, driving home the implication that Crockett was out of her depth, a guest in a chamber built for seasoned men like him. His smirk betrayed his confidence. This was the moment he would define the narrative, paint her as emotional, unprepared, unfit. But Crockett remained composed. She didn't blink. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her shoulders squared. If Rubio expected her to bristle, to interrupt with flustered indignation, he miscalculated. Instead, she let him keep digging, deeper and deeper into the hole carved by his own arrogance. The audience felt it. The tension wasn't just in the words, but in the space between them. It was the atmosphere of a duel, where one wrong move could tilt the balance of power. Rubio was circling, confident in his advantage. Crockett was still, waiting like a fighter measuring the rhythm of her opponent's swing. And then, with the chamber hanging on the edge, she struck, not with volume, but with precision. "Senator," she began, her voice steady, almost disarmingly calm, "I appreciate the lecture, truly, but you've mistaken my willingness to listen for an inability to understand. Don't confuse humility with ignorance." The room froze. Her words cut through the chamber like a blade. She hadn't raised her voice, but the quiet authority carried more weight than any of Rubio's flourishes. She leaned slightly forward, her gaze fixed on him, not defiant, but unwavering. "You talk about prudence, about comprehension, But what you're really describing is the comfort of those who've sat in power long enough to forget what urgency feels like. For the families waiting on solutions, for the communities left behind, patience isn't a virtue, it's a punishment. And I will not apologize for bringing urgency into this room. The Senate chamber stirred. A ripple passed through the audience. Staffers stiffened, senators whispered, journalists' pens scratched faster across their notepads. The duel had shifted. Rubio blinked, momentarily unsettled. He hadn't expected composure with teeth. He tried to recover, to reassert dominance. That may sound eloquent, Congresswoman, but governing isn't about sound bites, it's about responsibility. Passion without experience can be reckless. Crockett didn't miss a beat. And experience without accountability, she countered, is dangerous. The line landed with force. Senators who had been silent all evening now leaned in, sensing history in the making. Rubio, for the first time, looked rattled. His polished demeanor cracked at the edges. The duel was no longer a performance for the cameras. It was a test of strength, of patience, of who could define the moment. And for every word Rubio spoke, Crockett answered not with fury but with clarity. She let him reveal himself, the arrogance, the condescension, the smugness that had once been his strength but now read as weakness under her light. The chamber had become theater. Yes, but also something more. A battleground of narrative. Rubio wanted to define Crockett as unfit. Crockett was redefining him as outdated. And with every calm rebuttal, she pulled the spotlight tighter around his contradictions. The silence after her words was different now. No longer tense with anticipation, but heavy with recognition. The room knew it. She had seized the upper hand, and yet this was not the climax. This was only the build-up. The duel was still unfolding, the next exchange promising an even sharper edge, because Crockett hadn't unleashed her full strength yet. She was still holding back, and the Senate was about to find out why. The chamber was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of uncertainty anymore. It was the silence of expectation. Every pair of eyes flicked between Marco Rubio, who sat leaning forward with the faintest trace of smugness still clinging to his expression, and Jasmine Crockett, whose calm poise had transformed into something sharper. She inhaled, steady and deliberate, and when she began, her voice carried a clarity that left no space for interruption. "Senator Rubio," she said, her tone laced with a respect that sounded more like restraint. "You've spoken a lot tonight about experience, about how long someone has sat in a chair, about how many years they've worn a title. But experience without courage is just tenure, and tenure without accountability is dead weight on the people we claim to serve." A ripple moved through the chamber. Senators shifted uneasily as though those words had brushed against more than Rubio. Staffers raised their heads, alert. Crockett let the pause linger. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "You call me new. You call me passionate. You say urgency is reckless. But let's examine what that means. Urgency is what a mother feels when she can't find baby formula. Urgency is what a veteran feels when he's waiting months for care. Urgency is what an immigrant child feels when their future is in limbo because Washington debates while families break." Her voice grew sharper, not louder, but more precise, like a scalpel. "And you, Senator, would call that reckless?" A murmur swept across the chamber. Reporters glanced up from their notes. Rubio adjusted his tie, a flicker of discomfort betraying him. Crockett leaned in, her delivery tightening. "You say you want prudence? Prudence is useful when we're balancing numbers. But when it comes to balancing lives, prudence too often becomes paralysis. And paralysis, Senator, that's not wisdom. That's cowardice dressed in procedure." The word cowardice struck like a hammer. Gasps erupted, audible this time. Even those seated in stoic silence blinked, stunned by the precision of the attack. Rubio's lips parted as if to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. "You talk about comprehension, about understanding the bigger picture. Let's talk about comprehension. Because comprehension isn't repeating the same speeches for decades. Comprehension is knowing that behind every statistic we recite, there's a face, there's a family. There's a story that deserves more than your dismissive patience." Her words rang against the marble walls, and the chamber seemed to draw tighter around them. Rubio's composure faltered further. He sat back, then forward again, as if his body couldn't decide whether to retreat or attack. Crockett seized the moment. "And you, Senator, who claim to carry so much experience, where was that wisdom when working people begged for relief? But your votes told them to wait?" Where was that prudence when climate scientists warned us of catastrophe, and you shrugged for the sake of donors? Where was that comprehension when families in Puerto Rico, your people, Senator, were left in darkness and you offered platitudes instead of leadership? Each question landed like a blow. The chamber pulsed with tension, the kind that comes when the villain's mask begins to slip. Rubio's hand clenched on the desk. He attempted a smile, thin and forced, but Crockett pressed on, her timing relentless. You underestimated me tonight. You thought you could frame me as naive, as unfit. But let's be clear, what you really fear isn't my inexperience. It's my refusal to play by the rules of silence that have protected this chamber for too long. Another pause. Then she delivered it. Her voice steady, her gaze unwavering, the kind of line destined to echo beyond the Senate floor. I didn't come here to wait my turn. I came here to speak for the people who've been told to wait their whole lives. And if that makes you uncomfortable, Senator Rubio, good. The chamber erupted, not with applause, for the decorum of the Senate restrained it, but with an undeniable energy. Senators glanced at each other with raised eyebrows. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Reporters scribbled furiously, already crafting headlines in their minds. Rubio's composure cracked. He leaned forward, his words tumbling out faster now, his practiced cadence slipping. Congresswoman, with all due respect, passion doesn't change the fact that governing requires. But Crockett cut him off, not with volume, but with an icy calm. Respect? She repeated, letting the word hang. Respect is earned, Senator, not demanded. And after what you've dismissed tonight, families, workers, immigrants, veterans, you don't get to lecture me about respect. The chamber exhaled in a collective gasp. Rubio froze, his face tightening, his usual sheen of confidence replaced by the unmistakable flicker of frustration. Crockett sat back slightly, not in retreat, but in triumph. She had dismantled his argument piece by piece, turning each weapon he'd tried to wield into a mirror reflecting his own failures. And she had done it with dignity, her voice never breaking, her posture never faltering. For Rubio, the trap he had set had collapsed. The cameras caught it all, the slight tremor in his hand, the narrowing of his eyes, the way he blinked too quickly as if trying to recover ground already lost. And Crockett, sensing the final stroke, delivered it with surgical grace. You see, Senator, history won't remember how many years you sat in this chamber. It won't remember how many times you told others to wait. History will remember who dared to speak when silence was expected. And I promise you, when my name is written, it won't be beside yours as a footnote. It will be as the voice that refused to be silenced. The room fell into stunned quiet. Even Rubio couldn't muster a reply. His polished persona, his practiced arrogance, his strategy of patronizing dismissal, shattered. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile or raise her voice in victory. She simply sat, composed, her gaze steady, as though she knew that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It reveals itself. And in that moment, the chamber saw clearly. Rubio had tried to corner her, but he was the one trapped. She had risen, and he had unraveled. It was the mic drop moment. Not in noise, but in silence, the kind of silence that follows when truth lands too heavy to ignore. And as the cameras rolled, as the nation watched, the realization spread. This wasn't just a debate. It was a turning point, and Rubio, for all his years of experience, had never looked smaller. The moment Jasmine Crockett's final words echoed across the chamber, the ripple effect began. It started as whispers among Senate aides, furtive glances, suppressed smirks, quick texts sent under the desk. But within minutes, the tremors of that exchange shot through Washington like a shockwave, and by nightfall, the entire country was vibrating with it. On social media, the scene exploded. Clips of Crockett's clapback spread like wildfire, chopped into 10-second snippets perfect for virality. One clip capturing her icy line, "Respect is earned, Senator, not demanded," hit 1 million views before the hour was over. Another, showing Rubio's awkward half-smile collapsing into a grimace, became the meme of the night. Users layered dramatic sound effects, slow-motion replays, even captions like, "When you think you've won but she brings receipts." The hashtags began to stack. Crockett clapback. Rubio roasted. Respect ice earned. By morning, her name sat at the top of trending lists nationwide, while Rubio's trailed behind like a shadow. On TikTok, teenagers who'd never watched a Senate hearing before reenacted the showdown, mouthing Crockett's words over booming background tracks. On Twitter, journalists framed it as a generational clash. Old politics meets new courage, and new courage wins. Cable news anchors replayed the exchange on loop. One called it the sharpest dismantling of a sitting senator in recent memory. Another compared Crockett's tone to a prosecutor delivering closing arguments that left the jury no choice. Across networks, the framing was clear. Rubio had been cornered, and he never saw it coming. Late-night comedy piled on. A popular host opened with, "Marco Rubio walked into the Senate thinking he had home court advantage. Then Jasmine Crockett turned it into a masterclass in public humiliation." The studio audience roared as clips rolled behind him, Rubio's face frozen in stunned silence while Crockett's words landed again and again. Another host joked, "Rubio asked for experience. Well, he just experienced getting roasted in 4K. But beyond laughter, there was something deeper at work. Voters, ordinary people scrolling through their phones, saw Crockett not just as a congresswoman. They saw her as a fighter. A single mother in Texas tweeted, "I've waited years for someone to speak like this. She's not just in that room for herself, she's in there for us." A veteran in Florida posted, "Rubio talks, Crockett delivers. That's the difference." Meanwhile, Rubio's camp scrambled. His aides tried to spin the exchange as spirited debate, but the images betrayed them. The screenshots of his clenched jaw, his faltering words, his hollow smile, they told the story more brutally than any headline could. For once, his polished armor of rhetoric looked flimsy, punctured by Crockett's precision, and the headlines themselves were merciless. Crockett freezes the Senate with fiery counterattack. Rubio schooled in shocking exchange. Respect is earned, and Jasmine Crockett just claimed it. Each one dug the knife deeper, etching the moment into political memory. What stung Rubio most wasn't just that he lost the exchange. It was that he lost it publicly, in an era where no misstep dies quietly. The clip was already immortalized, replayed millions of times, dissected on podcasts, remixed into parody songs, burned into the collective memory of a digital age that forgets nothing. And Crockett? She didn't gloat. She didn't storm onto Twitter with victory laps or interviews. Her silence became its own kind of power. The contrast was striking. Rubio scrambled, Crockett stood still, and the world filled in the narrative for her. For her supporters, the moment was validation. For her critics, it was grudging respect. And for Rubio, it was a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Every headline, every trending hashtag, every meme of his faltering smile was another reminder. He had walked in with confidence and walked out diminished. He never saw it coming. And yet, the question lingered. If one exchange could tilt the ground beneath him so violently, what would the long-term consequences be? Was this simply a viral embarrassment? Or had Jasmine Crockett just shifted the balance of power in ways no one expected? The nation held its breath, waiting for the aftershock still to come. As the dust settled on the Senate floor, Jasmine Crockett understood something that went far beyond the exchange itself. This clash was never truly about Marco Rubio versus Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't about titles, seniority, or who could talk louder in a room of microphones. It was about something deeper, about the way dignity can stand unshaken even when arrogance tries to cast its longest shadow. In that instant, Crockett didn't see herself as a lone voice facing down a senator. She saw herself as part of a larger story, one written across generations, from freedom riders who refused to move, to workers who organized when the odds were stacked, to young people today demanding a fairer country. Every chapter spoke to the same truth. Power that relies on intimidation eventually crumbles, while power that comes from conviction endures. Her words in that chamber carried more than personal weight. They echoed with the collective strength of those who've been underestimated, dismissed, or told to wait their turn. She knew that her composure, her sharpness, her refusal to shrink was not simply for her own defense. It was a message sent to millions watching. You are not invisible and you are not powerless. The lesson radiated beyond politics. It reminded the nation that the titles stitched onto a nameplate don't make someone untouchable. The real measure of leadership is not whether one can belittle others, but whether one can inspire them. Rubio had walked in wielding rank. Crockett walked out wielding respect. And respect, once claimed, cannot be revoked. Even those who did not agree with her politics had to acknowledge what they witnessed. Some called it the clearest example of grace under fire seen in modern debate. Others described it as a living illustration of what happens when authenticity collides with arrogance. The consensus was undeniable. Dignity had not only survived the clash, it had defined it. For communities who saw themselves reflected in her strength, immigrants, working-class families, women of color, the moment offered more than spectacle. It offered affirmation. It said, resilience is not just about enduring insults. It's about transforming them into fuel. It said, the voices that were once ignored are now writing the narrative. And so Crockett's counterattack became more than a viral highlight. It became a parable of resilience in the face of dismissal. It was proof that a calm, steady truth will always outlast the loud, hollow performance of arrogance. Politics may shift with headlines, but dignity is timeless. In the weeks that followed, analysts dissected her words, comedians replayed her timing, and Rubio's stumble was catalogued into history. But what endured was the moral clarity. This wasn't about scoring points. This was about reminding America what true strength looks like. True strength is not sharpness without substance. True strength is not laughter at another's expense. True strength is the quiet confidence that when tested, you will not falter. And Jasmine Crockett showed the world that true strength belongs not to those who claim the microphone first, but to those who speak with conviction last. This wasn't just Crockett versus Rubio. It was a moment where dignity rewrote the script. It was resilience turned into history. It was a reminder to everyone watching that arrogance may win the headline of the day, but dignity defines the legacy of tomorrow, and that is the lesson history will remember. Marco Rubio tried to corner Jasmine Crockett. He thought laughter and condescension could diminish her. But her clapback didn't just shock the Senate, it froze it. One line transformed arrogance into silence, and one woman's dignity into history. That is the story behind the title you clicked. Marco Rubio tries to corner Jasmine Crockett. Her clapback shocks the Senate. But the truth is, it wasn't only about her. It was about what happens when authenticity refuses to bow, when courage refuses to be quiet, and when resilience refuses to be erased. If her voice shook the Senate, imagine what our voices together can do. Imagine what happens when millions refuse to accept intimidation as the status quo. Imagine the power of ordinary people standing shoulder to shoulder, declaring with clarity, dignity will not be silenced, and that's why this story doesn't end here. It begins with you. Every share of this video carries the lesson forward. Every subscription adds strength to a movement that believes in truth over arrogance, in service over spectacle, in justice over empty power. So don't just watch history. Be part of it. Subscribe now, hit that bell, and join a community that refuses to shrink in the face of intimidation. Share this story with friends who need to see what dignity looks like under fire. Let the echo of this moment ripple far beyond the marble halls of Washington. Because in the end, politics may try to divide us, but dignity unites us. Crockett showed the Senate what resilience looks like. Together we can show the world.